Okay, so the first video lesson was an introduction to the endocrine system. The second focused more on the pituitary gland and the fact that it's called the master gland, since it looks after a lot of the other hormones. It kind of regulates their function because of the hormones it produces. How the hypothalamus is known as the master switchboard since it regulates the function of the master gland. Now we're going to move on and talk a little bit more in detail about some of the other glands. So the thyroid gland is the butterfly-shaped gland that's found in your larynx, or just in front of your trachea, just below your larynx. It produces a couple of different hormones. The first kind of have the same action. So that's thyroxine, which we often refer to as T4, and triiodothyronine, which is much easier to say as T3. Since T4 is converted to T3 for them to have their action, they really do the same job. And in order to make them, you have to have enough iodine in your diet. And that's important for you to know because you'll understand some of the disorders a little bit more, knowing that they have to have iodine present in order for these hormones to be made. These hormones act on many of the body cells, and they cause them to increase their metabolic rate. Okay, so they basically cause them to break down more foodstuff, and so that process is cell respiration, and that ends up using up our oxygen. In the process, it releases energy, so you have lots of energy to do things, and it gives off heat. So if your body is growing, or if you are doing something active, then you're probably going to have higher levels of thyroxine because you need to meet those needs of your cells. If your body's cold, you might also have higher levels of thyroxine, but instead of trying to get the energy, it's more so that you can release the heat in order to raise your internal body temperature. So it works with growth hormone in regulating growth and differentiation or development in your body, and it increases blood sugar and fatty acid levels in order to meet your body's demands. The other hormone that's produced by the thyroid gland is called calcitonin, which we'll talk about after. But before we do, we'll talk about some of the disorders that are related to thyroid hormone. If there's not enough T4 and T3 produced, so if there's not enough thyroxine and triiodothyronine, we say the person has hypothyroidism if they're not producing enough. Hypo, if you think someone is hyper, they have more energy than normal. If they are hypo, then that means less. So these people would have less than normal amounts of the hormones. So their metabolism would be lower than normal. And so because their metabolism is lower, they're not going to be breaking down their food as much and getting as much energy. They feel a little more lethargic. They might eat the same amount, but they're not breaking down stuff as well as they probably should be. So they may gain weight, and they may feel cold because they're not releasing as much heat. And along with that, they'll probably be a little irritable. The opposite of that is called hyperthyroidism. So there's too much thyroid hormone, and in these cases, the person is breaking down a lot more food, and so they get more energy, and so they feel hyper because they have extra energy for their cells to do stuff. Because they're breaking down all the stuff that's coming in, then they're going to end up oftentimes will lose weight, or certainly won't put weight on, because even if they overeat, they're probably going to break all that down and not store as much. Because their metabolism is so high, they would be releasing more heat than a person who's got normal levels of metabolism, so they would feel hotter and often sweat. They're so hyper that they're wide-eyed a lot of the time and have a hard time sleeping, so they have insomnia and increased heart rate. A certain form of hyperthyroidism is known as Graves' disease. This is the cause of about 50% of the cases, and it's an autoimmune response where their body produces antibodies to bind to the thyroid-stimulating hormone receptors that are on the gland, turning the thyroid gland on. So our immune system goes and binds to those receptors, and that makes the thyroid produce extra thyroid hormone. So we have increased levels of T3 and T4 and increased metabolism. Another disorder linked with the thyroid hormone is known as goiter, and this is a picture showing a person with a goiter. Basically what happens in this case, the person is not getting enough iodine in their diet, and so because they're not getting enough iodine, they aren't able to produce T3 and T4, so their levels are low, and so the pituitary gland keeps on releasing thyroid-stimulating hormone, saying, hey, come on, you need to make more T3 and T4, the levels are low. And because it keeps on trying to stimulate it, the gland itself, the thyroid gland itself, grows, and so because it's growing so big, it makes a swelling in that area. So some of the symptoms, if it gets this big especially, would include coughing and a choking feeling all the time, like when you go to swallow stuff, you just feel like you're choking on things all the time. This isn't as common now because we have iodized table salt, and our soils tend to have higher levels, so it's not as common in these areas, and it's quickly treated if they notice it's starting to happen, but it is more common in underdeveloped areas. Caffeine effects. If you read in your book, it talks a little bit about what caffeine does in terms of the thyroid gland and thyroid hormone. It actually inhibits TSH production, and so therefore it inhibits thyroxine, or thyroid hormone production, and reduces glucose metabolism. So it lowers your metabolic rate. The link with weight. Sometimes people are seem to be able to eat and eat and eat, and they don't tend to gain weight, and a lot of times that's because they have a higher metabolism than other people, and so usually the reason for that is because they have a higher level of thyroid hormone in them. So higher thyroid hormones mean they'll end up with a higher metabolic rate, so they break down their nutrients faster, and so there's not really much excess there, usually left over in order to be converted into fat or for storage. If they have a lower level of thyroid hormone, then their metabolic rate is lower, and so they obviously aren't going to be able to break down those nutrients as fast. And so if there's excess, then it'll get stored in the liver and muscles, but any excess beyond that is going to be stored as fat. So they tend to have weight gain. This is the typical feedback loop. So you have the hypothalamus that releases a releasing factor and tells the pituitary gland to release a certain hormone that goes and tells another gland to release its hormone. So in this case, the hypothalamus releases THRF, thyroid hormone releasing factor. It causes the pituitary gland, the anterior part, to produce TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, which goes to the thyroid gland and tells it to produce its hormones, thyroxine and triiodothyronine. When the levels are high enough, then they will shut off these earlier steps. So, negative feedback loop. very similar to the one for testosterone, for LH being released from the pituitary gland to increase levels of testosterone. ACTH's effect on the adrenal gland, and so on. Now, the other story for the thyroid gland is calcitonin. Calcitonin is the other hormone it produces, and if you look at the first of the word, that's a hint for which ion it helps to regulate. So, calcitonin works antagonistically, so it has the opposite effect as PTH, so parathyroid hormone, in order to regulate blood calcium levels. Calcitonin would be released when calcium levels are high in order to lower them. So if you remember back when we talked about the excretory system, PTH is released when we want the kidneys to reabsorb or keep more calcium in the body. So it would increase the level in the blood. So this does the opposite. It would cause the kidneys to excrete more, and it causes it to be put into the bones. Okay, so that it lowers the amount that's in the blood. And that's the whole idea. We need to have lower levels at that time. And it helps to maintain homeostasis that way. Just a quick note about calcium and why it's so important that we regulate the levels and that we have an adequate supply. It's really crucial for growth of bones and teeth. You'll learn in grade 12, if you take biology in grade 12, you'll learn about how our nervous system works, and it is really important. It's needed in order for us to have proper functioning of our nerves and brain. So in order to release the special chemicals called neurotransmitters when they fire. It's also important for contraction of muscles during body movements and formation of blood clots for healing to happen. So calcium is really important, a lot more than what we tend to think of, which is usually just that we're needed for bones and teeth. The parathyroid glands are embedded in the thyroid glands, and they produce, it's really hard to remember, but parathyroid hormone. Okay, this hormone we just mentioned has the opposite effect of calcitonin. So instead of lowering the levels in the blood, it's going to help to raise levels in the blood. So it causes the bones to release calcium into the blood. It will cause the kidneys to reabsorb it so it doesn't go out in the urine. Causes their intestines to absorb more from whatever we've eaten. And basically the overall effect is to increase the amount that's available for our tissues. So this would be higher if you, say, had a broken bone, and so you need to have a whole lot of calcium going to repair that bone, or maybe you're building a baby inside of you, so you need to have a whole lot of calcium going to making its bones and its teeth and all of those things. Another thing that the parathyroid hormone does is it helps to regulate production of vitamin D. So this process starts in the skin and continues in the kidneys. It requires activation by the sun, so that's why they tell us we do need a little bit of sun. Basically, vitamin D is a steroid hormone that increases calcium absorption in your intestines. So because it's so important in our diet and for making sure that we get enough calcium, then we basically have supplements in pill form, but also in many foods like our milk. This is a diagram in your book, which is really helpful for understanding how the two hormones are related. Okay, so if levels of calcium are too high in the blood, then the thyroid gland is going to release calcitonin. Calcitonin is going to go to your bones and tell them to take in more calcium. They'll go to the kidneys and say, hey, excrete more calcium, etc., etc., in order to lower blood calcium levels. If the blood calcium levels are low, then the parathyroid glands are going to release parathyroid hormone, which travels to the bones, tells them, hey, release more calcium. It'll tell the kidneys, reabsorb more calcium, and tells the intestines to absorb more calcium from whatever they've taken in their diet, all so that we can increase the amount that's in our blood in order to take it to wherever it's needed. Okay? So, this is just a couple little side notes on the side here. PTH promotes production of vitamin D, which helps to increase our calcium levels. So it works along with the hormone itself in order to increase calcium levels because it helps so that our intestine can absorb it. That's just saying what we already said, but in a quick note form. Next, we shall move on to the pancreas. So the pancreas has, both of the pancreatic cells are exocrine in nature, so they're exocrine glands. That means that they are producing substances that are going to leave through a duct and either go into the digestive tract or out of the body. So those products are enzymes and bicarbonate ions. We talked about that in the first video. In terms of its endocrine function, there are little islands, kind of tissue within the pancreas that are called islets of Langerhans. Let me see. I should be able to find a little picture very quick, like the one I showed in class the other day. Pancreas. There's some images here. Yeah, that's good. Okay. So this is the pancreas, and if we took a little section of it and looked at it in a bigger form, you'd see a whole lot of these cells. So these are the acini cells, which are glandular, and they are the ones that will make the enzymes and the bicarbonate. But these ones in here, the colored ones, are the islets of Langerhans. So there's different types of cells that make up the islets of Langerhans. Some of them are known as alpha cells and beta cells. The purple ones shown here are representing alpha cells, and the pink ones, or pinkish red, are representing the beta cells. There's some other cells too, but those are the ones that we're more focused on here. Alright, so these cells produce two hormones that are antagonistic of each other, so they have the opposite effect. They produce insulin, which I'm sure you've heard of before, and glucagon. So insulin is secreted by the beta cells, and its overall job is to lower our blood sugar levels. And they do this by stimulating our cells to take the glucose in. Glucagon has the opposite effect. Secreted by the alpha cells, and its job is to raise blood sugar levels. So it stimulates the release of glucose from different tissues in our body into the blood. And sometimes it stimulates the release of other stuff so that glucose can be made and released into the blood. But the ultimate goal is to get more glucose into the blood. This is a schematic diagram that just means words and arrows that describes or shows what happens when insulin does its job. Maybe I'll show you this little video up first if it's working okay. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of highlight a couple of things here that you just watched. So the insulin binds to a receptor. So it's obviously not a steroid hormone. It's a protein hormone. It binds to the receptor, and it caused a chain of reactions to happen and ultimately caused a little transport protein to be put into the membrane. So it increased the number of them in the membrane. And those transport proteins are what helps to facilitate glucose going into the cells. So remember we learned about facilitated diffusion. We need those little transport proteins there so that the glucose can get through from where there's more of it to where there's less. So we'll just watch that little part again. So it's going from the blood into the cell. So that's how the insulin works. This is just a schematic diagram, again, to show in words and arrows what is happening. So basically, you eat a meal, and your levels of glucose in your blood is going to be high after your meal. So your body has broken down the complex polysaccharides, and we take in the small glucose molecules, and they're floating around in your blood. That triggers the pancreas, specifically the beta cells, to release insulin. And the insulin is going to go and bind to most cells and cause them to have more of those transport proteins so they can take in glucose, which is used for energy. So because they're taking it in, it lowers the amount that's in your blood. When most of the glucose has been used up by the cells, if there's extra there, then it will be taken into your liver cells and your adipose tissue and your muscles for storage. So in the liver, the glucoses would be kind of stuck together in the form called glycogen. In fat cells, if there's excess glucose floating around, then your body's going to tend to store it as fat. And it will also store some glucose in your muscle cells so that there's an energy supply, a quick energy supply there for them. So in both of these cases, because the tissues or the cells are taking up the glucose, it's going to lower the blood sugar levels, or lower the levels of glucose in the blood. Glucagon, on the other hand, is released if you've been fasting. So if you didn't have your breakfast, or if you hadn't eaten meals at a certain time, then remember, your body always has to have glucose because it's the only sugar, or the only source of energy that your brain cells can use. Okay, so if you've been fasting and you use up all your stores of glucose, then your body's going to respond in order to try and get more glucose released or somehow made and released into your blood. So in this case, your alpha cells of your pancreas are going to release glucagon, and they're going to go to those places of storage, so your liver cells and your adipose tissue and your muscles, and they're going to cause them to release energy sources, okay, or things that they can use to make glucose. So in your liver, it causes, first of all, glycogen to be broken down to give us glucose directly. But when those stores are gone, it'll cause your muscles to release amino acids, and the amino acids will be picked up by your liver cells and converted into glucose. Okay, so your liver does a couple things. It releases the glucose directly from glycogen stores it has, but it can also make glucose from the amino acids that were released from your muscles. Fat is going to be broken down to give fatty acids in order to provide your cells with other energy sources. So your brain has to have the glucose, but the fat can be broken down to give fatty acids, which can be used by your other cells directly as a form of energy. Okay, and this just is the note that I mentioned. of what happens to the amino acids that are released from the muscles. So this diagram is also in your book, and it shows the antagonistic effects of glucagon and insulin. So if you've just had a meal and your blood glucose is high, then your pancreas is going to secrete insulin, and the insulin is going to tell your cells, well, it binds to your cells and causes more of those transport proteins to be put in the membrane so that the cells can take in the glucose. Now, a lot of the cells are going to use the glucose right away for energy, but it'll also tell these cells, the liver, the muscle, and the adipose tissue, to take in the excess glucose and store it. When blood sugar levels are low, so in between meals, or if you skipped a meal, then your pancreas is going to secrete glucagon instead. And glucagon is going to go to those storage places and tell them to release glucose. Okay? And also it will cause, if you've been going for too long without food, then it'll start to break down your muscles in order to be able to get your liver to make more glucose. So it doesn't happen every time, but if you are really low on glucose, then it'll start to draw. It draws first on your glycogen stores in your liver, it'll draw then on your fatty tissues, and then it'll draw on your proteins in your muscles. Okay, so if you skip meals for too long, then your muscles will start to thin. Disorders linked with the pancreas. Of course, we know about diabetes mellitus. We talked about it with chapter 11 when we were talking about different things in people's urine and quantities of urine and how you might see symptoms of diabetes to do with the urine that's produced. But for our purposes in this chapter, we want to know a little bit more about what happens in them. So with type 1, the immune system starts to attack our own cells. So it starts to think that the beta cells are foreign, and it destroys them. So the body loses its ability to produce insulin. Now this may happen early on, but it could happen later on. But in either case, like later on, maybe it's triggered by a certain illness or whatever, but it causes your immune system to start attacking your own pancreatic cells. In any case, the body can't produce insulin, and so without insulin, your cells can't take the glucose in, and that results in elevated glucose levels. This type has to be treated by monitoring blood glucose and being given insulin to inject or using a pump. Type 2 diabetes is the more common form. It's the case in 90% of diabetics. It used to be called adult onset diabetes because it tended to happen later in life and was often associated with being overweight. In this case, the insulin is produced, but it's usually not working right. So it's either not being recognized or the body's not able to respond to it, and there's a thought in many situations that the adipose tissue is interfering. In either case, they result in higher than normal levels of blood glucose, and because they have extra glucose in their blood, they end up with extra glucose going out in their urine, and water will follow it. So they tend to have to go to the washroom a lot, and so they also, because they lose so much water in their urine, they're often thirsty. Because they can't take in the excess glucose, they often will lose weight, and they won't have energy, circulatory disorders because of the excess sugar floating around, and eventually they could have some vision problems. So it's really important that they are getting the proper treatment. So insulin is given to people with type 1, and sometimes people with type 2. Type 2 is often a combination of medication and diet and exercise, so to keep everything in balance. Here's a little animation. Oh, I may not be the right link. Yep. Well, there was an animation. They changed it. There's an information link at least. Okay. The people who did this section were to learn a little bit about Banting and Best, and it's kind of interesting because it was a Canadian discovery. Basically, they discovered the cause and treatment of diabetes in 1922, and they did so. You can read more about it in your book. They did so by studying a dog that was made to have diabetes. So they basically removed the pancreas, and they took the insulin from the pancreas, and when they gave the secretion or what they extracted back, then it normalized the dog's blood sugar. So they were able to find that the product from the pancreas actually helped in the treatment. The extract was given to humans, but the ingredient that was doing the work had precipitated out. So they tried it again using pure extract, and they found that it worked. So now we actually produce insulin on a mass scale using engineered bacteria, which is pretty cool. Before that, they used to have to extract it from animals, like sheep. And it was quite a breakthrough in its day. And there's a couple of videos that are linked there. This video is starting to get a little long, and we still have some other glands to cover, so I'll let you watch those on your own. The thymus gland is the next one we'll talk about. This is the one that I jokingly say it's the disappearing gland, or as a disappearing act. It's larger when you're small, and it disappears as you age because its job is taken over by the spleen and the lymph glands. So the thymus gland produces a hormone called thymosin, and thymosin's job is to stimulate production and maturations of lymphocytes into functional T cells. So it helps, in general terms, it helps to build your immune system. So it's bigger when you're young because it helps to establish and get your immune system working really well. And then as these other parts, your spleen and lymph glands, take over, then it's not needed as much. So they're called T cells because they mature in the thymus. The pineal gland is a small gland at the back of the brain. It's towards the back as opposed to where the pituitary gland is. So you know now how to find the pituitary gland. So the other one that you'd be expected to know within the brain is the pineal gland. It's also called the epiphysis. It produces a hormone called melatonin, which is a modified amino acid, and you can often find it as a supplement that you can purchase at stores. Its job is to help regulate your sleep patterns. So it's lower in the morning, and it increases as daylight ends, which causes you to become sleepy. So sometimes people will actually take melatonin, or sometimes it'll be even suggested to them that they take melatonin in order to bring about sleepiness, to help them sleep at night. Seasonal affectiveness disorder is fairly common in areas where they don't get a lot of natural light. And it can cause depression because their sleep levels are out of whack, because their levels of melatonin be out of whack too. So in those sorts of places, a lot of times people will order in special lamps in order to make it feel like it's artificially daylight, more hours of the day, so they can get their melatonin levels and their sleep patterns better balanced. In terms of your gonads, gonad means sex organ, so that's the testes and the ovaries. The hormones that they produce are mostly involved in development of our male and female characteristics and involved with the reproductive cycle, especially the menstrual cycle in females. So the testes produce testosterone in response to LH, so luteinizing hormone causes the testes to produce testosterone, and like we said in the other video, its job is development of secondary male characteristics like growth and development of the genital organs, the penis and the testes, growth of muscles, enlargement of the larynx, so the Adam's apple, hair and face, chest, underarms, pubic hair, and so on. The ovaries produce estrogen. Estrogen is the female counterpart of testosterone, so it causes development of secondary female characteristics in the female. Okay. It also produces progesterone. So the progesterone, just a reminder, starts similar to pregnancy, and it prepares the uterus each month in case you become pregnant, and then it maintains the pregnancy if you do become pregnant, and it inhibits further ovulation from happening if you're pregnant. So the level of those hormones tends to rise between the ages of 8 to 12, and then sharply to stimulate development during puberty. The adrenal gland is probably the more complicated to understand and keep straight. If you remember in chapter 11, when we talked about the excretory system, we talked a lot in terms of renal things. So renal artery and renal vein and renal cortex and renal medulla or renal pelvis. Those are all referring to the kidney. So renal means the kidney. When we say adrenal gland, that gland is situated on top of the kidney. So for some reason I don't have a picture of that, so I'll quickly go and show you. Okay, so here's the kidneys, and the adrenal glands are located right on top of the kidneys. And just like the kidney has an outer region and an inner region, the adrenal gland has an outer region called the adrenal cortex and an inner region called the adrenal medulla, or the cortex and medulla. And each region is regulated in a different way and produces different hormones. So this diagram is in your book, and it is really good to help keep those things straight. Okay, so here's the pituitary gland, and here's the hypothalamus, which is the master switchboard that controls it. Now, there are nerves that go from the hypothalamus, sympathetic nerves, that will extend from the brain through the spinal cord down to the adrenal medulla. And so the adrenal medulla is going to release certain hormones in response to a stressor. Okay, so this is showing a stressful event happens, and the hypothalamus, the brain's going to interpret it as being stressful, send messages down the sympathetic nerves, okay, which release norepinephrine or noradrenaline, and they tell the adrenal medulla to release, oh, look at that, more noradrenaline or norepinephrine, but also adrenaline or epinephrine. Okay, so those hormones are responsible for a really quick stress response. Okay, the nervous control is really quick. So because it's under nervous control, these will be released immediately, and that's how we get our big adrenaline rush if something happens. So it causes, if you think of the fight or flight response or stress response, the things that happen, our heart rate increases. Okay, our blood pressure will increase as well. Blood glucose levels are going to rise. Our breathing rate increases. Our muscles become energized so that we can run if we have to, or lift something heavy if we have to, or whatever. But it's going to direct the blood and everything away from your digestive tract. So your digestive tract is kind of like, no, we don't need anything happening here right now. All of our time and effort needs to be focused on our muscles and brain and heart and lungs and those things that need to react. Okay, so it's a very quick response. The other way that we respond to stress is a slower response. It helps us a little bit more in the recovery from a stressful event. So the hypothalamus sends a releasing factor, releases a releasing factor to tell the anterior pituitary to release ACTH. So that's adrenocorticotropic hormone. So it's going to act on the adrenal cortex. So AC is for the adrenal cortex, basically. So it goes to the cortex, oh dear. Goes to the cortex and it tells the cortex to release its glucocorticoids and its mineralocorticoids. So basically it's corticosteroid hormones or corticosteroids. They are going to bring about these other responses. Okay, so it's going to cause your muscle cells to break down fat. Your fat cells to break down, muscle cells to break down proteins in order to give amino acids. It causes fat cells to break down fats. So trying to give other sources of energy for your cells. It'll cause your circulatory system and immune systems to kind of slow down their inflammatory response. Okay, so it keeps them from sending white blood cells as much out into areas where there might have been some inflammation. So it's a suppressant. It slows those things from happening. It also causes reabsorption of sodium ions, which from the kidney, so that we don't lose more. And what follows as we reabsorb the sodium is water. So it increases the blood volume and blood pressure within your blood vessels. All right. So if we look at them in a little more detail, we said the adrenal medulla is the inner region controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. Because it's controlled by the sympathetic nervous system or the nervous system, it's a quick response. It produces mostly adrenaline, but it will produce some more noradrenaline. Okay, but in general, the effects of these two hormones is the same. Let's bring about the stress response. So increased heart rate, increased breathing rate, cell metabolism. Causes vasodilation, so we get more oxygen and nutrients available to the tissues. Breakdown of glycogen in the liver, so that there's more glucose available for immediate use by your brain and your muscles and for your organs that need it at the time. And we said it dilates the pupils, so you can see as much as possible. This was just some extra questions that were thrown in because your book does talk about them. So caffeine does act like adrenaline, and what happens with it is it inhibits the breakdown of cyclic AMP in cells. So the cyclic AMP extends and amplifies its effects on cell processes. So if it's causing contraction of the heart muscle, then it's going to increase contractions of the heart muscle. So it's a stimulant in that way. So it acts like adrenaline. It acts as a diuretic. So it inhibits ADH, which usually causes you to reabsorb water. So because it inhibits ADH, it increases your rate of urination. It increases the amount of water that goes out there. Because it does this, it also results in more calcium being excreted than normal, which can lead to osteoporosis. If you're not keeping enough calcium for proper bone development, then it can cause your bones to end up with little holes in them. So that's one kind of, reason why maybe you shouldn't have too much coffee, especially if you're females, because they're more prone to osteoporosis. Nicotine also stimulates production of adrenaline, ACTH, cortisol, and ADH. So because it stimulates production of adrenaline, it's also a stimulant. It also increases estrogen secretion in male smokers. So if you've been smoking for a long time, then it can affect your sex hormone levels. The adrenal cortex, we mentioned earlier, it's controlled by the hypothalamus via the endocrine system. Okay, so it causes more of a long-term response to stress, and it helps your body to recover from stressful situations. It produces 3 types of hormones. They're all corticosteroids. So cortico meaning they're made by the cortex, steroid meaning they are steroids, and so they are hydrophobic and they have a certain way of acting on the cells. So they basically will affect transcription and translation levels in the cells. They go right in and bind to the DNA with their receptor, and they increase transcription and translation. So there are glucocorticoids, which are going to affect the levels of glucose in the body. There are mineralocorticoids, which will affect the level of certain minerals in the body. And it also produces sex hormones. So this is why males not only produce testosterone, but they also will produce estrogen. So the adrenal cortex produces estrogen in males, and it is the reason why females can produce testosterone. Okay, so we'll look at them in a little more detail. So the example of glucocorticoid that we'll talk about is cortisol. And cortisol is going to act on muscle cells and cause the breakdown of proteins into amino acids so that those amino acids can be used by the liver in order to make glucose. The fat cells are going to be broken down to give fatty acids, which will go out into the blood and be used as excess energy supply. It'll cause also the capillaries to decrease permeability, so they're not going to let white blood cells to go out and try and bring about the immune response or try to attack other things and cause swelling and inflammation in those areas. So it decreases that. It also causes your blood and tissues to decrease the amount of antibodies and lymphocytes that are around. So the overall response is for these ones to increase the amount of glucose and fatty acids available to the cells for energy, but it also suppresses the immune system, lowering inflammation. So these are really important in times of stress, and it's also used because of its anti-inflammatory properties. It's used to treat skin injuries, arthritis, asthma, autoimmune disorders. All those things are treated using corticosteroids, like prednisone. for cortisol. Okay, there's a couple little videos. I'm going to link them to the main page, but they're kind of important. They talk about the corticosteroids, how they work, and then the types of things that you should consider if you were taking them. This is a diagram that you would have in black and white. It's also linked to the class notes page, and you should be familiar with it. So basically, a stressful situation is identified by your brain and causes the hypothalamus to release cortisol releasing factor, which travels to the pituitary gland and says, hey, there's something stressful going on, you need to release your ACTH, so adrenocorticotropic hormone. So the anterior pituitary gland, the anterior lobe, releases ACTH, which will travel in the blood to the adrenal cortex. And it stimulates the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. The cortisol will act on the circulatory immune system to suppress the immune response, so it suppresses inflammation. The cortisol is also going to act on these three types of cells in order to increase overall glucose levels and other sources of energy. So it causes muscle cells to break down protein and release amino acids into the blood, causes the liver cells to take in those amino acids and make glucose, because your brain can only use glucose, and it causes your adipose tissues to break down fats and give fatty acids into the blood so they can be used for energy by the rest of your cells as a backup supply. So a way that your body helps to recover from a stressful event. One of the questions that was asked was, why do corticosteroids cause fat deposits in the face, neck, and abdomen when they are taken over time, or if you have a condition that causes you to have higher levels of it? Basically, they stimulate what cortisol would normally do, which is to elevate levels of glucose to your body tissues. But if there's excess out there, then after the stressful event has gone past, then that glucose is going to be stored as fat stores, and they tend to be focused or concentrated in these areas. So you end up with a moon face, like a lumpy area, a big bump in the back of your neck and in your abdominal area. Okay. There are studies and videos out there that talk about how living a high stress life will end up causing your cortisol levels to stay higher than they should, and that's not good for you. So there's a couple of really good videos on there, and I'll share them on the class notes page so that you can watch those as well. Really important to take the time to make yourself relax. The mineralocorticoid that we're going to talk about is aldosterone. And this name should sound familiar because we talked about it when we were talking about the excretory system, and in terms of how your kidney helps to regulate blood pressure. So, aldosterone is released, again, in times of stress or when your body detects that your blood pressure levels are low. Remember, there's a whole big response using the juxtaglomerular apparatus as well, that if there's a reason why we have low blood pressure, then it's going to kick in to release aldosterone in that way too. Okay, so aldosterone acts on your kidneys, causing reabsorption of a mineral, specifically sodium ions. So the sodium ions will be taken in from the filtrate that's passing through in your nephrons. It'll be taken back in, and what follows it? Yep, water. So because the water follows it, then that's going to cause the blood volume to increase, and so your blood pressure will increase as well. Okay? So this is a really useful diagram, especially for people who are visual. But again, in a stressful event, the quick response is through the hypothalamus sending message via the sympathetic nervous system to the adrenal medulla, which is going to release noradrenaline and adrenaline in large amounts, and that's how you get the adrenaline rush and the fight or flight response. As a slower response, the hypothalamus causes the pituitary to release ACTH, which travels in the blood and causes the cortex to release the glucocorticoids like cortisol and the mineralocorticoids like aldosterone, and it causes a slower recovery response where we get more production and release of glucose. If the levels are low, we get breakdown of protein and fats in the process to help recover. So proteins to get the amino acids to make glucose, and the fats in order to get fatty acids as another supply of energy for your other cells. In the process, the glucocorticoids like cortisol also cause reduction of inflammation, and that is why corticosteroids like prednisone and cortisone, like cortisone shots, are given in order to help when we have inflammation or things like asthma, autoimmune disorders, things like that. Okay, so that is the adrenal gland, the more complicated of the ones we're going to deal with. So if you were labeling this diagram along the way, then we'll do A would be the gland that's towards the center or a little more to the back of the brain than the one we're used to identifying. So this one is the pineal gland or the epiphysis. Okay. B is showing that part of the brain that's the master switchboard and controls this master gland. So the master switchboard is the hypothalamus. Okay, and the master gland, which is hanging down below it, is the pituitary gland. D is pointing to the butterfly-shaped gland that's in front of your trachea, so that's the thyroid gland. E is pointing to the ones that are embedded in the thyroid gland, so that would be the parathyroid gland. F is the disappearing gland. Okay, so F is the thymus gland. G, glands sitting on top of the kidney, so they are the adrenal glands. And H, the cottage cheesy looking one, near your stomach and intestines, so that's the pancreas. And if you're being even more specific, it would be the islets of Langerhans. Here, I'm going to put that. Islets of Langerhans. Okay. This is the female part, so ovary, and the male part. Testy for 1, testes with E is for 2. Okay, so those are the endocrine glands. As we label them on the diagram. Okay, a couple of disorders that you should recognize or know about that have to do with corticosteroids, especially cortisol. Cushing's disease or Cushing's syndrome. Cushing's syndrome is when they show symptoms like Cushing's disease, and it may be because they're on a corticosteroid for certain other disorder that they have, and they start showing those symptoms of having high cortisol levels, or it could be that they might have a tumor or some internal internal reason that's causing them to naturally have higher levels because of something that's going on in their body. Okay, so it's called a syndrome if if they're showing the symptoms of the disease because of an external reason, like taking medication that increases the levels or acts like cortisol. But basically, it's because of excess cortisol or things that are acting like cortisol. Cushing's disease is when it's caused by pituitary tumor and high ACTH levels. Symptoms that they show: moon face, muscle breakdown, fat in their abdominal area. They might sweat a lot. They might have hyperglycemia, so higher than normal levels of sugar in their blood, or hypercalcemia in some rare cases. That's higher levels of calcium than normal. That was the case for the young girl we watched in the house episode. Okay. Provided they find out what's going on. If they find that there's a tumor in on the pituitary gland, then they can go in and remove it. Usually they'll do an incision inside of their upper lip, or they might go in through their nose, in their nasal cavities, and remove the tumor. Now sometimes that means that they might lose parts of the pituitary gland or part of its normal function, so they'd have to have their levels of hormones monitored and probably take hormone supplements in order to have a balance in their life. Addison syndrome is kind of the opposite. So levels of adrenal cortex hormones are lower than normal. So if you have lower cortisol than normal, then you'd have the opposite. So low levels of blood, hypoglycemia, weight loss, low blood pressure, because aldosterone levels would be low. So low blood pressure because the aldosterone is not causing the absorption of sodium and water. And often low sex drive. Okay, and this one is caused usually by the body attacking its own adrenal cortex tissue and destroying it. So that's Addison syndrome, the opposite of Cushing's. Well, the opposite kind of symptoms or effects. The last of the glands we're going to talk about are the digestive glands, so glands in the digestive organs. And we're just going to talk very briefly about them. Your stomach produces a hormone called gastrin when proteins enter it, or even when you see food and start to get excited and your body's preparing for food to enter your body. Okay, so the gastrin will cause release of gastric juices from the gastric glands in your stomach, and those contain, or that, I guess, gastric juice contains hydrochloric acid and pepsin, an enzyme, which will help to break down food stuff, so specifically proteins in your food stuff. Your small intestine will produce prosecretin, which is an inactive form of secretin, and the secretin gets activated when acidic stuff coming from your stomach, which we know as chyme, enters your small intestine. So when that comes in, that's saying, hey, there's food here. I need to release the enzymes and other stuff that is needed in order to break down this food further. So secretin travels to your pancreas and causes your pancreas to release pancreatic juice, which has enzymes and bicarbonate ions. Just a sec. Sorry, you might have heard that. My son whacked his hand on the door, but he's okay now. Okay, so I was just saying that the secretin travels to the pancreas and causes release of pancreatic juice. And the pancreatic juice, so remember we showed those other kinds of cells in the pancreas that are exocrine in nature, and they'll release enzymes. So they release enzymes through the duct, the pancreatic duct, and they release bicarbonate ions, which helps to balance the acidity level. So it balances the pH so that the enzymes will work when they get to the small intestine. It also travels to the liver and gallbladder, tells them to release bile. And the bile helps to prepare fats so that they can be broken down by the enzymes. So it kind of pulls them into smaller, smaller molecules. So they like to kind of organize themselves so they protect their hydrophobic regions from water. So it kind of allows them to be pulled apart and worked on by the enzymes. So the overall effect of secretin is to cause the accessory organs, so the pancreas and the liver and the gallbladder, to release things that are going to help break down food stuff, so carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And that should be it. That was a really long video lesson. Sorry, I should have broken it down to be smaller chunks, but you can go through, and I'll even put in the description, I'll put where you can find different glands. So, sorry to be so wordy. Hopefully it helps.